I tell you, we we looked woeful in the auditorium a minute ago. We may be down tonight. I don't know what's going on in town. But the auditorium was sometimes that's a traffic on the roads issue.
It can be in Nashville.
Since we moved to 6:30 from, yeah.
Did you ever have a Sunday service at 6 instead of 5?
Yes.
That's a pretty tight window.
Yes.
It seems like you sit down and turn around, it's 5 o'clock.
Yeah, no joke.
That's not bad, but most congregations have 6 o'clock.
You know what it is? When you've got it one way, you want it the other way.
That's right. Yeah.
That's the way I am.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, man. Uh-oh. Here they come. Here they go. You already got it going here, right? I am live, and as opposed to Memorex. Yeah, oh yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, we're going to start out in John chapter 20. John chapter 20. And we'll move along as time permits into a couple other waters as well. John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29 is where we sort of teased it last week. What did Jesus mean? What is this conversation about? What did Jesus mean when he said that? Well, tonight that begins specifically with verse 27. But let's go back to John 20, verse 24, and going through verse 29, which almost finishes the chapter. Which, interesting, by the way, I didn't think about this last night when I teased it, or last week rather, when I sort of teased it. But this is just before the beginning, obviously, of chapter 21, which finishes his whole gospel. And in chapter 21, the most emphasized portions of chapter 21 deal with Jesus' conversation with Peter and that last recorded conversation that they would have. And you know that a good bit of that focus when we think about that conversation is about Jesus saying, Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And he asked him 3 times. And I never thought about this last week just because we were running out of time and I was just, again, mostly just teasing it for this week. But I think there's something somewhat fitting about what we're going to see, especially Jesus saying in verse 27, with what comes in chapter 21. I don't think it was intended for that per se, but I think it was good that it's there, whether Peter took to it or not. But I'll get to that in just a minute. Chapter 20, verse 24, to go back. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, We've seen the Lord. And so he said to them, Unless I see his hands, the print in his hands, the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Well, let's pause right there for just a second. Do you ever feel like occasionally some of the disciples, even some of the apostles, some situations you read about even in the book of Acts, where somebody gets a little bit of a bad rap, a little bit of we're too critical maybe, Of all the disciples, who might get, now this should be an easy response, which is going to make nobody respond. I shouldn't have said that. but no, I think you'll know who I'm chasing here. Of all the disciples, hint hint, who became apostles. So let's look at the 12. Which guy probably gets a little bit of a bad rap here? Yeah, that's what I would say anyway. Why? Well, what do we know about Peter? Well, Luke 22 is what we know. Now we know more, but Luke 22 is what we know, and he was the one that denied the Christ, right? Or, oh, Peter didn't have enough faith. He sank in the water. Well, does Scripture show anybody else stepping out of the boat? Right? Lord, shall we smite with the sword? You know that, Peter? And he didn't wait for an answer. He asked the question, but he didn't wait for an answer, and he smote. Okay, and so you can talk about Peter being impetuous. You can talk about being him, any adjective you want to use. But you know what? He was passionate. He was passionate, and there was a reason he was picked in Acts chapter 2 to preach the greatest sermon ever known to man. We can say what we want to about Peter, but he was the one that got picked. With all of his whatever, he had some other. He didn't just have the whatever. He had some other, and the Lord knew what he had. Well, right here, doubting Thomas, that's what we call him. Do we give him a little bit of a bad rap? Is it possible? I mean, you ever thought about that? Doubting Thomas, that sounds like a little bit of a criticism, right? Sounds like a little bit of a criticism. Well, what had he seen? What's his picture in his mind? His picture in his mind is they've taken him away. And then the picture is further developed into now he's being beaten, and I'm seeing this maybe at a distance. And now he's carrying his cross and he's falling under the weight of that. And all that we can picture from the sham trial all the way to Calvary, not to mention Calvary itself, all of that he's seen. Then he's seen him go to the tomb. And had Thomas or any of the other disciples, or anybody else for that matter, ever seen a guy roll away the stone and walk out? No, nobody had ever seen that before. So put yourself in those shoes, and can you blame the guy? Can you blame the guy for saying, unless I see? Now, look, try not to look at this through the lens of our study of faith. Having what we have now in a written word, we know how the story ended with Jesus. We know He appeared, we know He spoke, we know He taught, and we know He ascended. We know He's returning. We know, we have, because we have. Don't try to picture Thomas with what you know and what you have. Picture Thomas with all he knew and all he had. And then ask the question, does he get a little bit of a bad rap? Doubting Thomas. I just sometimes feel bad for the guy. David. Mm-hmm. These are guys, that's a great observation, David, because these are the guys who would eventually, and history records this isn't debatable. Somebody doesn't have to believe in the deity of Christ. This is not debatable. History records these guys went to their death for their claim. Now, do you think you might? You could say, kind of have the position. Look, if I see, I'm going to hold to it. I'm going to hold to the claim. I'm going to preach the claim. I'm going to claim it. I'm going to stick with it. And if that means my own death, so be it. But who's going to go to that for a hoax or something misunderstood? So David's comment speaks to the legitimacy of the resurrection, that he was going to, if I'm going to stand having reason to stand. So maybe Thomas, sometimes like Peter, gets an unfortunate type of a rap here. So he said what he said. We've read through verse 25. Verse 26, after 8 days, the disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Now I'm going to work backwards right here. Look at verse 29 as it wraps up that section as we read it. The second statement Jesus made, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Is Jesus criticizing Thomas here? What do you think? Or is he just making a statement of that which is to come? I just think he's making a statement of that which is to come. I don't think that's a criticism. Well, yeah, sure you believe because you're sitting here putting your hand in me. But I tell you who's blessed, the people that don't need all the proof you seem to need, Thomas. I don't think that's what's happening right here. I just don't. Number one, it doesn't fit Jesus. Not now. It doesn't need to. Not now. Compared to before, when Jesus had to say things like this to the disciples, "Have I been with you this long and yet you still do not understand?" He said that 3 times in a single chapter, I think. Have I been with you this long and yet you still don't understand? You can hear maybe frustration in the voice or a facial expression or body language of disappointment. I don't think that's what's happening here. There's no reason for that to be what's happening right here, and it's not consistent, I don't think, with Jesus. I think he's saying 2 different things. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Back to David's observation a few minutes ago, I think is proper right here. He's going to know the legitimacy of the resurrection. And that's important because he's one of guys who were going to have to go out claiming the eyewitness, who would also then go and be willing to die for their claim. And Jesus knows this. There's a reminder. You've seen me. Now you've got this, right? You've got this. Now you can go with this. Now, Jesus makes another statement in verse 29 that's about those, especially those to come. Now, faith is the what? Evidence of things, or excuse me, the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. So let's keep working backwards with that in mind. Let's keep working backwards right here. So Thomas has seen, and he's made the statement that we see in verse 28, "My Lord and my God." By the way, I'm going to tell you what I deeply believe right here. Deeply believe. I deeply believe Thomas in verse 25. The Thomas that we see in this section and throughout this conversation, he wanted to believe. He wanted to believe. He makes the statement in verse 28 that he makes because it's confirmation of what he wanted to believe. I'm going to tell you something. You're going to have trouble believing if you don't want to. Now, there are things we can want to believe and choose to believe that we have no basis to believe. That happens all the time. But I'm going to tell you, want to is vital to believe. When somebody says, well, I don't know. Why would somebody not want to believe? Are you kidding? Plenty of reasons. A lot of times because there are choices they want to make in their life or have been making in their life that coming to belief that presents a problem for things they would rather believe. We don't like conflict. We don't like a contrast that brings a conflict within us. I'm going to tell you, it's hard to get people to believe if they don't want to. By the way, this is why Jesus would say, you go to a town, they're not receiving you, meaning they're not receiving your message. What did he tell them to do? Shake the dust off the feet, leave. And by the way, they knew that. They knew this was a cultural thing. They knew what that meant. Take off and there'd be dusty sandals, open toe stuff here. Okay, walking through. So they knew, and this was a common cultural phenomena or tendency that people would have to make a point. It was a message. So they said they're not receiving your message. I'm done for now. I'm done. You don't want this. We're going to go somewhere where they'll be more receptive. By the way, that passage does not say don't return to that town. He didn't tell them and never return to that town. That's important. But they're not ready right now. Want to is important. So, let's remember that. I believe Thomas wanted deeply to believe. And that's why I believe in verse 28, I believe that was an emphatic. It's hard to try to hear it, but if you can try to hear it and try to see it in a facial expression, a body language, a tone of voice, whatever, try to hear that in verse 28. I believe it was emphatic, and I believe he always wanted to, of course. Daryl.
And in contrast, the Pharisees did not want to believe because the soldiers came and said, hey, he's been, he kind of resurrected. And instead of them going like, wow, we can't believe it, we killed the Christ, go like, here's some hush money.
Yeah.
So they bribed the soldiers not to tell them that.
Right. That's a great insertion, well-timed insertion right here, Daryl. Jesus would make the statement, and I'm paraphrasing, he would talk about those who would be seeing but not perceiving, and hearing, and they wouldn't be believing. And why did he say that would happen? They'd have that, but it wouldn't have the desired effect or the needed effect on them. He said, lest they would see with their eyes and believe, and I sure would heal. Why would somebody not want to be healed? That Jesus is speaking of that which he has the power to do. Why would they not want that? Why would they refuse that? Okay? If the doctor says, I'm going to give you this, this, and this, and it starts with a painful shot back here. If he says you got to take this and you got to see me this many times, David says you got to use this cream or that cream, or I got to take that off your skin, that doesn't look good, whatever. What does that mean? You can receive news that says you've got a problem. When the doctor says you need to come in, I need to see you again next Tuesday, and you thought you were done and they're bringing you back, there's a reason. The idea that I might need healing is a problem because that tells me I've got a problem. Are you telling me I'm sick? There are people who don't want that. They don't want the message that they've got a spiritual problem. I need to be good enough on my own. So, I don't like, Jesus would talk about the people that don't want to. They see, they hear, but they don't want the message because of what it would mean for them. Now keep working backwards. to verse 27. So he's appeared, he said, peace to you, and now we pick up in verse 27. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be believing, but unbelieving. That's the primary focus on this particular set of verses for the remainder tonight. I want to talk about verse 27. Well, I asked the question already, is Jesus rebuking Thomas when he says, don't be unbelieving, but believing? Is he saying, stop? Stop! You stop this unbelief junk right now. Like a parent telling a child, stop it right now. I just don't think that's the intention. I just don't think that's what he's saying. But I do believe the words of Jesus right here remind us of some things that other scriptures remind us about. So hold your place right here and go over to Hebrews chapter 11. Go over to Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, you get, pick up in verse, it starts as early as verse 3. It says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. Verse 3 begins, by faith. Verse 4, by faith. Verse 5, by faith. 7, by faith. 8, 9, 11, 17, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, keep going, 27, 28, 29. And it keeps going. On and on through the remainder of the chapter by faith. Now, which one of these, and this isn't a trick question, which one of these by faith whoever, by faith Moses, by faith Abraham, by faith, which one of these by faith don't show a choice made? Doesn't show a choice made. In every character mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, you've got somebody having to choose something. One of the most famous that we remember, and I remember from early Sunday school years in, third grade, Sister So-and-so's class, is this picture of Abraham, for he went out what? What about Abraham does Hebrews remind us? He went out. Well, we talked about that last week in Genesis 22. God sees intent and talking about the sacrifice of his son. But what about Abraham? He went out not knowing where he was going. No GPS. And that's not meant just directionally. He went out not knowing where he was going. It wasn't directionally like this, flying blind, as somebody says. Not knowing where he was going was referencing, which ultimately led up to what you just mentioned in slaying his son, or the potential of slaying his son. He went out not knowing where he was going is not talking about direction. It's for what purpose and what's it going to be? What's it going to be like? What's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? What's it going to call me to choose? And every one of these Hall of Fame characters in Hebrews chapter 11 had to choose to be, here's the word back to verse 27 of John 20, choose to be believing. Every one of them. At some point in time. That's why he begins Hebrews 11 with the verse that he does. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Now don't get me wrong. We're not called to a blind faith because we don't have a blind faith. We have reason to believe. A book I can recommend to all of you is Reasons to Believe. It's a great book. Okay? Reasons to Believe. I beg you to believe and I believe you believe this or you wouldn't be here. We've got reasons to believe. Scripture doesn't call us to a blind faith. By the way, it's why we need to know apologetics to help other people who are saying, or who are talking to us as if our faith is blind. And they're not interested in that. You've got to show people that we have reasons to believe. Every one of these people in Hebrews chapter 11, their faith, it was by faith what? By faith they, and just read the rest of the verse, they weren't doing something different, which was sacrificial and so when Jesus says, be not unbelieving but believing, he's talking about be making choices that reflect faith. Be making choices that reflect belief. Use this, Thomas, to make choices that reflect belief. Go to Mark chapter 9. Somebody read verse 23 and 24. Mark 9, 23 and 24. Just when you get there, go ahead and read it out loud. I believe, but help my unbelief. Some translations will say, help thou my unbelief, which means you help it. I need you to help it. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Let me tell you what I, no pun intended, believe. Here's what I believe about that statement regarding belief. I believe that needs to be a Christian's daily prayer. Now, whatever. It doesn't have to be the words, but why not? Why wouldn't that be a daily prayer? Because it's a new day, right? It's a new day. Tomorrow's a new day. The day after that, if the Lord allows, is a new day. And guess what? I could have made a by faith choice that would have made it into Hebrews chapter 11 on Thursday, and I can break the heart of God on Friday. Let me say that again. I can make a choice or a series of choices, statements and choices on a Thursday that are a Hebrews 11 type of stuff, and I can turn around and break God's heart in less than 24 hours. Lord, I believe. Did Job say that? Yes, in 1,000 different ways, not with those exact words, but he used enough words to stake his claim. Job knew who he was. Who was he? Well, I'll tell you who he was according to Job chapter 1, according to the words of God himself. Not the word of God, the words of God to Satan before he let him touch him. Have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in all the earth. He's blameless and upright. That's a pretty good resume. You can put that on your resume as a reference. Call God, he'll call me blameless and upright. You're going to get a lot of jobs. But, or rather, and so, Job stood his ground and said, I don't understand why this is happening. And he didn't just say that to his friends. He didn't just say it to his own wife, who said, by the way, curse God and die. He had to stand against all that. He said it back to God. He said it back to God. Why me? I am faithful. You know me. Okay, now that's the guy you can have on Thursday. You can be that guy or that guy on Thursday. And you can break the heart of God on Friday. Lord, I believe, but help thou unbelief. Today, my prayer is today. I know what I was yesterday. I'm glad that you were proud of me yesterday. My prayer today is I will not be unbelieving, but believing. Because both of those words, hear this, both of those words are in effect phrases. They're in effect phrases. I am in effect unbelieving when I make certain choices. In other words, it's in effect or as if. It doesn't equate me to that, but it's as if. And I'm in effect believing when I make other choices. And so when Jesus says, be not unbelieving, but believing, there's a choice to be made. And I think way too many people think, believe it. How can I choose belief? What do you mean, how can you? That's the only way you can. And you choose it in choices. And Thomas and the rest of these guys were about to have to make choices that would lead them to their death. By the way, I said this part of this chapter leads into chapter 21, where Jesus has his conversation with Peter by the sea. Do you remember what happens? He eventually has to say to Peter, when Peter's irritated that he's asked him 3 times, he eventually has to say, and I'm paraphrasing what happens in chapter 21, when he says, Peter, it's been quite a ride, hadn't it? You've seen things nobody had ever seen before. You've been in the inner circle of one who can heal the sick, raise the dead, cause the blind to see. You've seen and heard things in the inner circle that people have never even imagined, much less actually been a part of. That's about to change. It's all been pretty cool, hasn't it? You remember when you stepped out of the boat and you were going pretty good, and then you saw the wind and the waves, and you started to sink? You remember that? But all of a sudden you didn't sink. Why? It's because I was there. Pretty cool, huh? You go back and tell your friends, I walked on water. Through the help of Jesus, I walked on water. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, about that. This is about to change. That's the conversation in John 21. This is about to change. In fact, let me tell you where you're headed. That's where you've been, but let me tell you where you're headed because of me. And they're going to bind you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Are you going to love me then? And Scripture says he signified the very death that Peter would die. Are you going to love me then? That's the question of John 21. I think it connects going backwards from that conversation in John 21. It connects all the way back to John 20:27. It's consistent thematically. It's consistent when Jesus says, be not unbelieving, but believing. Jesus is asking Peter later in John 21, but he's asking Thomas right now, reminding him and all those that were within earshot. There's coming a time when you've got to choose belief. From this point forward, choose belief. It's not going to insulate you. It's not going to insulate you from life's problems. Told Peter he was going to die because of it. But choose it. Be not unbelieving, but believing. He's not talking about the snap of a finger, change something in your mind. He's talking about consistency of choice. Consistency of choice. You ever heard this phrase where somebody says to somebody else, don't tell me how to feel? You ever heard that? And what do they normally come out with? Why do they say, don't tell me how to feel? Well, it's kind of this idea of, what do you mean? I can't make myself feel a certain way. Well, not instantaneously. I feel how I feel in the moment. For good or bad, right or wrong, I still feel how I feel. How can you tell me just to like you're flipping on a light switch? Now, feel this way. Oh, okay. You can't do that. That's what they mean. But this is different. Because it's not talking about how you feel. Faith is not asking, how do you feel today? Faith is asking, what are you going to do regardless of how you feel? What are you going to choose regardless of the safety involved or no safety? What are you going to do regardless of the popularity or no popularity? What are you going to do with doing it with a group or standing alone? What are you going to do anyway? This is about the anyway. This is in effect. Be not unbelieving, but believing. That's John 27. Any thoughts on that? And we'll jump to something else. All right. So let's go to Mark chapter 9 and verse 50. Mark chapter 9 and verse 50. Somebody else, Luke 14, 34 and 35. So let's say this. Over here on my left hand, Mark 9:50. Over here on my right hand, Luke 14, 34 and 35. All right, let's read those. Take off when you're ready. Back to back. Mark 9:50.
Salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what would you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another.
Luke 14, 34, 35. Ooh, left side of the room was...
Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its favor, how shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
By the way, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. When Jesus uses that phrase, which he does numerous times in the Gospels, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. It does remind us that Jesus being able to have effect, the words of Jesus being able to have an effect on us is totally on us. The word let is massive. He that has ears to hear, let him. It's on me. That reminds me of Jude. It only has one chapter. And in the one chapter book of Jude, verse 21, you keep yourselves in the love of God. So, he would say to these people in earshot, you see the same thing in Matthew 5:13, which we didn't go to, that there is the possibility of being saltless salt. In fact, there's a translation or two that uses the expression saltless salt. And so, I want to start. What did Jesus mean when he said that? I want to start with this. The Jewish rabbis, and this is what the hearers would have understood. The Jewish rabbis of that day, they write now, and they wrote, and they spoke and taught then of Israel's role, the nation of Israel, Israel's role as the purifying agency of all the nations. We are the nation which brings purification. We're the only ones that can. Why would they say that? Because we are the children of Israel. We are the children of God. We're the only children of God. And so the rabbis would speak of this, and they would speak of it culturally as Israel was played a primary role as the purifying agency of the nations. Salt was considered that which would purify and preserve. Purify and preserve. Now, your reading said if the salt has lost its savor, you remember when Jesus would say it is henceforth what? Good for nothing. Now think about the words Jesus is speaking, to whom they're being spoken. An Israelite's total well-being was wrapped up in being the people of God. It'd be, I guess, to some degree, like over various generations, I am a Kennedy. I am a Rockefeller. I am a Duncan. Right? I mean, and that's all I need. I don't need anything. I got the heritage. I got the heritage. And they did have the heritage as God's people, and that's their total identity. And when Jesus says, if you lose your salt, you're henceforth good for nothing, who likes to be called a good for nothing? By the way, Jesus would say, and we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, that if you call somebody worthless, and I hate going back and thinking about this because you don't have to answer, but I am still going to ask. You don't have to answer, and be sure you're as stiff as a board with no facial expression here. You'll see why. Have you ever called somebody worthless or referred to somebody? I don't mean you told them, but referred to somebody as he's worthless or she's worthless. Now, I'm not looking because I don't want you to tip your hand. And yet, remember when Jesus said, whoever says, Reka and thou fool? Remember that? We looked at it a couple of weeks ago. Should be guilty of hellfire. You know why? One of those expressions was empty-headed pig. When you look at it in the Hebrew, it's empty-headed pig. You called somebody... Now, empty-headed pig. For a Jew to refer to someone as a pig, well, how do they view pigs? Unclean, right? Remember the prodigal son? He would have just been as one of the pigs. That parable takes advantage of what they would not be able to fathom because that's their view, right? You called him an empty-headed pig, which was a statement speaking to worth. It was a statement speaking to someone's worth. Now, why might God not want those types of statements and thoughts about people? It's His what? It's His creation. Worthless. So, when Jesus says, if the salt has lost its savor, it is henceforth good for nothing but to be trodden under the foot of men, that's not something that they would take very easily, or they'd be able to accept, right? They are the purifying agency of the nations. They are salt. But it's possible that they may not be what they think they are just in a name. Go to Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, and Colossians 3, verse 7. I don't care which order we take them in. Somebody in 4:6 and somebody in 3:7. Colossians. Colossians 4:6 and 3:7. And then just read when you get there.
Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
Okay. Seasoned with salt. My speech should bring something and bring something in particular. That's 4:6, correct? 3:7. Kyle's got it. Go back at least one verse and then read through that verse again. Okay, just before that, he speaks of behaviors that on account of these behaviors and these choices, the wrath of God is coming. And you too were like that. You too were like, it reminds me of the passage that says, and such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified. Why? Only through Christ. Okay, so he contrasts in those two chapters and verses, Colossians 4:6, Colossians 3:7. Here's what you were, but You're supposed to have been purified. Go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14. Somebody read that. Matthew 5:14.
You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden.
The disciples' public life is in view. The disciples' public life is in view. By the way, nowadays, it's in more view than you think. It's in more view than it's ever been. It's more scrutinized. It's in more view. If you've got any social media, it's in view. Right? You talk about the disciples' public life being in view. It's in more view now than it's ever been. I just realized what time. Is that clock right? I guess it is. And I know you're going to say so anyway. So, so we're going to pick up right here because we're on this trail that what does Jesus mean when he's talking about salt having lost its savor? Remember who he was talking to. They were the nation that was supposed to be the purifying agency of all other nations. They were supposed to be the nation of preserving and purifying. The disciples' public life is in full view. That was the reminder of Jesus at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:14. We're going to start next week in Mark chapter 9, and we're going to look at a series of 6 or 7 verses that will connect this to answer the question, what does Jesus mean when he talks about salt? What's the real warning when he talks about saltless salt, basically? The salt's lost its savor. In other words, its purpose. So we'll continue to pursue this next week. First, probably third of our class time, and then we'll skip down to something I want you to see in Matthew chapter 23 on a different saying. So next week we'll finish this saying and we'll go through a different saying for the majority of our class time. All right. So unless Eric Jenkins has wisdom for the group, and we trust Eric is wise. If he doesn't have any wisdom for the group, we'll be over for the night. Got any? Not tonight? Not tonight.